Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who've experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. Today, we are talking about gardening and community healing, the VSC Passion Flower Project. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Education Coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. With me today, I have Danielle Uhran. Danielle uses she, her pronouns and is one of our Social Work Pre-practicum interns at the VSC, currently pursuing her Master's in Social Work from the Florida State University with a certificate in Gerontology. Danielle is passionate about helping victims of sexual assault, violent crime, and traumatic circumstances move towards a path of healing. So Danielle, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
And I also have returning Stephen Wilson. Stephen uses he, him pronouns, earned his Bachelors and Masters in Social Work from the University of Central Florida, and is a crisis counselor and victim advocate at the VSC. Diversity, inclusivity, social justice, compassion, and respect are values he lives by. His passions include nature, traditional gardening, and aqua-scaping or aquarium gardening, which sounds amazing. The Passion Flower Project is literally a passion project. He believes that a connection with nature is a means of finding inner peace. His hope is to share his passion for nature and gardening so others can heal from their trauma and appreciate the beautiful world around us. So Stephen, thanks for coming back onto the podcast. Happy to have you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me again.
I am super excited to have this conversation. On this podcast, we have talked a lot about different forms of therapy, mindfulness, and self-care. Research has actually shown that gardening can be another outlet for individuals. According to an article featured in the Journal of Health Psychology, gardening can help reduce stress and cortisol levels, which is the stress hormone. With that, today we are going to talk about how gardening can be used in a therapeutic sense, the misconceptions and myths regarding this practice, how plants can be used for metaphors and help survivors of trauma, and VSC's own community garden group called the Passion Flower Project. So to start off, could you tell me a little bit about the Passion Flower Project and what inspired you to make it?
So gardening has always been a passion of mine. And when I was in my MSW program, I had an opportunity to do a small group with the classroom. And so we planted seeds and, we used that as an intervention, and it was really fun. So I proposed it to Joellen and my supervisor, and she was happy to do so. So I was able to start the Passion Flower Project as an intern, and myself and another intern were able to launch it. And
and here we are.
Yeah.
Very cool. That's really awesome. What kind of plants do you typically use, by the way? And is there a symbolic reason for why you chose specific plants?
Absolutely. So there are most of them, in fact, all of them are flowering plants, but more specifically, they're butterfly plants. And some of them allow for pollination. Some of them allow for monarch butterflies to have a home. One of the plants that we like to use is milkweed, because it provides a home and food and as well as shelter for monarch butterflies as they're going through their migration. So the mother butterfly will lay her eggs on the stems. The caterpillars will then emerge. They'll eat all the leaves off of the milkweed, and the milkweed is actually toxic. It makes the caterpillar less desirable to birds and other creatures because they don't want to ingest the toxin. And that's well known. So that's why the butterflies always love the milkweed. And plus the flowers are just so beautiful, and it allows for pollination as well.
That's awesome. I actually never knew that. So thank you for teaching me that, Stephen. That's really cool. And the garden is just, it's at the VSC itself.
Mm-hmm. It's located in the southeast corner of the parking lot. So not only can Victim Service Center employees and clients be able to view it, but as well as anyone else in the building or passing by.
That's so awesome. I'm so excited to see that. Danielle, I wanted to ask you specifically, like, what made you interested in leading this project with Stephen?
So I wanted to do the Passion Flower project with Stephen because I wanted to help victims of trauma move towards healing. And I recognize that gardening is an activity that has many benefits, such as emotional regulation, brain-body connections, expanding coping skills, as well as increasing self-compassion and hope for the future. I think gardening helps people heal and overcome, and is good for their mental health in several ways, such as looking after a garden gives people a sense of responsibility, and it can help those suffering from trauma relax and let go. And it helps victims connect to the purpose of nature, such as self-care and tending to your own garden. So that's just some of the reasons why I thought it would be amazing to be able to join and facilitate with Stephen.
That's awesome. I love it. I can definitely tell that you're both really passionate about it. I think that it's a wonderful thing. And I'd like to kind of delve into why gardening can be therapeutic. So how can gardening be therapeutic? And what are the benefits? You were talking a little bit about them, but I wanted to kind of expand on why and how gardening can actually be therapeutic.
So gardening can be therapeutic because it can increase self-compassion and sense of hope. And it's a way to be able to expand self-care techniques. And in the way that we take care of the garden, we learn how to take care of ourselves.
To follow up on what Danielle was saying, is that we like to use a lot of metaphors in the garden. So like she was saying, is like the self is the garden. Like, look at all the work we put into, say, this pentas, right? We're digging a hole for it. We're making sure that it gets the proper nutrients, making sure that it gets the proper water, the proper sunlight, the proper boundaries from other plants as well. And those all kind of relate back to self-care and how we need to take care of ourselves. And so we just use a lot of metaphors throughout the garden. For example, like what we call groundbreaking, when we prep the soil and everything, that's grounding techniques, right? Like we're really teaching grounding techniques during that phase.
That makes a lot of sense. It sounds like you're kind of gardening in a mindful way and then kind of reflecting on that. And is that kind of like the process for the Passion Flower project? So do you have like how long is it? And then do you have like steps as you go through, like, okay, today we're going to be focusing on this, and then next week? How exactly is the Passion Flower project kind of structured, I guess?
So the first session will be primarily focused on groundbreaking and grounding techniques to kind of build upon that for future sessions. So the second meeting is primarily focused on boundaries and planting. Like we spoke about before, like we want to plant the plants far enough apart so that they have enough space to grow and to get the nutrients and water that is needed. And then we kind of wrap things up. By group number 5, we kind of relate that back to the cycles of emotions and the cycles of the weather, and how that, like a rainy day is really good because we need those rainy days to supply those nutrients and to like have this, because we can't take the sun without a rainy day, right?
I love that. I love that you talk about the weather and emotions and those kinds of things, and how metaphors are used. In that, within that context, how can gardening be therapeutic specifically for survivors of trauma?
I can name some things, and Stephen can as well if he wants to jump in too. So a few things that of how gardening can be therapeutic to victims of trauma is that gardening can help them connect to the purpose of nature, and it can help them feel renewed inside and establish an appreciation for simple things in life. It also can benefit them move towards healing, such as helping them develop memory, cognitive abilities, and task initiative, and social skills, which has been proven to help emotional regulation and to decrease stress and anxiety and improve overall mental health just by simply gardening. And it's been a technique that has been used since ancient times.
That's awesome. And I know, Stephen, that you talked about how the weather and emotions can kind of go off of that too. Are there any other metaphors in relation to trauma that you want to bring up?
So the tree is one of the metaphors that we use in the Passion Flower Project. If you think about a tree, you often don't think about all of the obstacles and the turmoil that trees encounter every day. They face harsh weather conditions, yet they still stand, they still survive, they still overcome. And sometimes even through those brutal conditions, they grow to become stronger through that, and they still stand. And so we can look at a tree and relate it back to things that people go through in their own lives, and how, although you may go through hard times, that just like the tree, we can overcome and we can be resilient and learn to be resilient like the tree.
I love that. Yeah, while you were talking, I was thinking of the word resilience and how we know that that's a really important word for survivors of trauma. I don't know if you wanted to jump in on that, Stephen, if you had anything else you wanted to bring up in regards to that.
Absolutely. So when dealing with trauma, especially sexual assault and violence, it's very complex, and it oftentimes consumes the person or just overwhelms them to a point where they don't know how to function, or they don't know how to deal with the problem that they're facing. And what I love about the idea of mixing gardening with therapy is, like, it takes things back to the most simplest form, right? Like, if we can appreciate the really small things, then that other ominous bad stuff doesn't seem quite so bad. Right. So, like, for example, if you see a little butterfly in the garden, like, you can think of a whole life cycle that is going to be happening in that garden. If that butterfly lays its eggs, and then we can nourish it. And it's just, it to focus on the little good things in our life makes the big bad things just not so bad, in my opinion. And like Danielle was saying with the tree, like, it starts out with this tiny acorn or whatever kind of seed. And it takes a lot for that seedling to break through that shell. All right. And for it to, like, go from 2 inches to 10 feet, that takes a lot as well. Like, it's not being, mowed over or anything like that, but it's not as strong, but it's still, enduring until it becomes that big, large tree.
I love that. I love that you brought up that there's stages of it that are difficult, but then it kind of reminds me of, like, the healing process in general, where, maybe we'll have, like, a bad day. Maybe the tree will have a really hard day and might lose its leaves or something like that. But we can look back and be like, but look where we started as a seedling or something like that. And that can be really impactful, I think, for survivors of trauma, and also showing that, like, healing's not always linear and there are going to be bad days. At the same time, we can grow and be resilient and use the tools that our counselors and our support groups and everything gives us. So I love that we can do that, which kind of brings me to my next question, is how we externalize. So how does gardening externalize things like emotions, and why is this helpful for survivors of trauma?
Because in the garden, we use metaphors for a lot of the processing of trauma. it externalizes the problem, right? Like we're separating the person from the experiences that they've had. Like your experiences do not define who you are, but through these metaphors, we're able to talk about those experiences so that they can objectively speak about them while relating them back to the garden, but at the same time, kind of processing what's been happening.
That makes a lot of sense. I think when we talk about things at the VSC, a lot of times we say things like, it's not what's wrong with me, it's what happened to me. And kind of, I can totally see how externalizing an experience and then being able to look at it kind of reminds me of when we had you on, Stephen, for music therapy, for example, being able to use an outlet to process something on the outside, kind of, and looking at it from that perspective and being able to do it that way. Danielle, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to expand on that.
I think that it can help victims of trauma because they can look at nature in a whole new way. Like, just for example, just by looking at the tree, they can look at their own lives and what they've grown through, who they've become, and relate themselves to the things that they've overcome, just as the tree overcame, so they can look at nature in a whole new way and relate themselves to the nature and how they've grown and what they can learn from nature around them.
And kind of what Danielle's like touching on is like, it gives them a sense of hope, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's, it gives them like, it puts in perspective, like, yes, I may be hurting right now. I may be going through this trauma right now, but there is tons of potential for me to grow. And there's that hope that I can get to this place. I can get from, survivor to thriver.
I love that. Yeah, we talk a lot about how that process can look. And I feel like the using nature as an inspiration, as a hope, it kind of reminds me of, when survivors might hear other thrivers speaking, for example, and just being able to relate to that. So that's amazing, which leads me to my next question, which is, how do you find that the communal aspect of a garden that is shared has an impact on survivors of trauma?
I want to wholeheartedly say yes. Last year when we were able to hold the group members were so enthusiastic. I was actually worried because it's a lot of manual labor, but everyone was so happy to do it. And that collective work, that teamwork, it really built a bond between all of the group members and the facilitators. That just, it created a huge bond that allowed us to do a lot of really good work moving forward.
That's awesome. I think that it really is reminding me of kind of support groups in general, and just kind of all of us being together, but also working on something and like that. Danielle, did you have anything that you wanted to expand on that as far as kind of the communal aspect of a garden, and making it a shared space, for example, and how that can be impactful?
It can be impactful because people can not only look at the nature, but they can look at the people that they're in the group with and see that they're not alone. They're not alone in what they're going through, because often, victims feel alone, and it's important for them to know that they're not, and that they're in a place of support and people that, are struggling with some of the same things, and they can find something that they connect with each other on through gardening.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I love that. And I like the idea of everyone kind of pitching in a little bit too, and seeing kind of something bigger and healing through that. And you talked about like the boundaries, and I kind of want to go back to that if you don't mind, and how planting and boundaries are important. So when you are doing these kinds of things, do you talk about like, while we're doing this, let's reflect on this, and then does everyone kind of share anything?
Absolutely. So there's a chance for everyone to share their story. Specifically, sexual assault victims often have trouble with boundaries, not only because their boundaries were violated, but sometimes they have porous boundaries. They don't have clear boundaries. So just like in the garden, how the plant needs its own boundaries, it needs its own space to grow into itself and to be able to absorb all of the water and nutrients. The same is true for like a person, right? Whether it's in a family or in a relationship, you need those healthy boundaries in order to like maintain that healthy relationship.
That makes a lot of sense. So when you're gardening, then I assume that that's kind of what you're reflecting on, and then kind of just hearing from survivors as well. Is that kind of how we move from like gardening can be more of like this therapeutic thing?
Absolutely. So we start the discussion around like the planting with boundaries and how much space is needed, there's just the technical stuff for the plant. And then we kind of do some reflecting on that. Like, so how does this apply to yourself? Like, how do we take a piece of this garden and apply it to us? Like, what boundaries do you have and what boundaries do you need to put in place? What boundaries could be strengthened and what boundaries could be softened up some?
I love that. And it actually brings me back to a question that I actually wanted to touch on before, but I forgot to ask it, which is, are there any stigmas surrounding using gardening as a healing tool? Do you hear any kind of misconceptions about it or any kind of myths that you want to break about that?
Yes, I have heard stigmas surrounding using gardening as healing, such as if you can't handle a problem by yourself with the help of your family, friends, or church, or whatever the support may be, then you're weak. And and I personally think that the stigma needs to die, and the only way to kill it is through education, because sometimes there's a stigma that, oh, if you're attending a support group, it must make you weak or crazy. But in fact, it makes you brave and strong for wanting to get real help. And what many people don't realize is how therapeutic gardening is, that it's a time-proven practice that has therapeutic benefits, and it's been known to improve mental and physical health.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate you breaking that down. Stephen, I don't know if there were any other like stigmas or any kind of misconceptions regarding using this as a practice.
I hear all the time that, oh, well, I don't have a green thumb. And what that really means to me is I don't enjoy gardening, right? And which is okay that's okay. If you don't enjoy gardening, that's fine. But the reality is water, sunlight, and nutrients. It's fairly simple. So if you can just meet those three basic needs, then you'll be able to garden. And so if gardening isn't your thing, you can find other therapeutic modalities or other ways to give yourself fulfillment. But like I often do hear that, oh, I don't have a green thumb. But it's just a matter of paying attention to it and, kind of like recognizing the needs of the plant.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And do you ever hear that people might think that gardening can't be used as a therapeutic tool, for example? And if like, oh, that's not really what you're doing, you're not really doing therapy, you're just gardening. So what would you say to someone who might approach you about that?
I would challenge them to come to one of our groups.
Yeah.
The topic of the conversations that is being facilitated basically by the group members. It's serious stuff, and they're working and processing through some serious trauma. And just the simple fact of them being able to be active and do something with their hands while talking about it makes it just a little bit easier for them to tell their story. So I do really believe that it has a therapeutic benefit to it, and science has also backed that up.
Awesome. Yeah, which, while I was researching for this podcast, I found that a lot of studies on gardening as a form of therapy are commonly known as horticulture therapy, highlight its positive impact on individuals and even results into positive change within their lives. So I know we talked about kind of the process of seeing a tree grow or a plant grow and those kinds of things. So why do you think gardening specifically can help bring change in someone's life in a positive way?
Like I said, it takes it back to the simplest form, and it's such an easy way to be mindful, right? Like when When you're planting, you feel the soil in your fingers. You look at the leaves, you can see the veins, you can see if it's fuzzy. Like when you look at flowers, you can see like how the petals are made, whether it has a center cone, all those different things. If you can pay attention to the little details that I find just beautiful, it's very uplifting, especially when everywhere you look around, there's little somethings, right? There's little bits and pieces of nature all around us. And so if you could see that little glimmer of hope and joy in it, then it just sustain you all day and all week.
I love that. Yeah, I agree. I think that, I think we're kind of saying the same things. But yeah, I can totally see how you can take something like gardening and be mindful of it and be able to reflect on it in a therapeutic way, just like you can do that with things like yoga and things like you could do mindful eating and those kinds of things. So absolutely.
Gardening with intention.
Yeah, gardening with intention. Absolutely. And I love that you're able to externalize it, process emotions. Survivors are able to share their stories. And with that, I wanted to see, can making a garden itself be empowering? And how is empowerment important for survivors of trauma?
Absolutely. So we end our group with like a celebration and ceremony. And that is to celebrate the work that all of the group members did, right? Like here we have this amazing, beautiful butterfly garden. And like, that's an accomplishment, right? Like you're not only contributing to this, parking lot that is now have a garden, but you're contributing to this larger ecosystem that you can now help house and shelter butterflies. You can give all the little bugs and the birds a place to come have a drink of water or get some seeds from the plants.
And why do you think that empowerment is specifically important for survivors of trauma?
It goes back to the whole like hope side of it. When someone has been through so much trauma or such severe trauma, it sometimes just consumes their mind, and it's hard to see a way out of that. And to have that kind of accomplishment, something that is so beautiful and has so much meaning to all of us, you're invested once you're a group member, right? So to see what you've accomplished and to have that pride and hope that that pride and joy that you did that and you contributed to it, I do think it gives a sense of empowerment. And for someone who had never gardened before or had never thought about doing it, and they're just like, oh, this sounds like fun. They learned they can do this. This is something completely new outside of the realm of what I normally do and my normal skills. And yet I learned some new skills. And that's life, right? We want to always grow and continue to acquire new skills. And the garden gives them the sense of hope that they can do that outside of the garden. They can acquire new skills to cope with what's going on in their world, or they could look at the garden and see what they've accomplished and be like, I can do this. I can step this foot out and I can go.
I love the way that you brought up that you can bring up a new skill too. That's another piece to this that I think about. And I can see why that would be a really empowering thing. And as we know, things like trauma, things like sexual assault, for example, are all about power and control. And so empowerment for a survivor or a victim of sexual assault is a huge thing. So I love that you have this ceremony. That's very cool. I bet you that's really impactful. Danielle, I don't know if you wanted to add anything about how gardening can be empowering.
Yeah. So I like to compare gardening a lot to a seed. I think of healing and growing much like a seed. The seed is covered by dirt and is under pressure, and it cracks open and it's about to do what it was designed to do, and that's grow into something beautiful. And when we are in the stage of growing, just like a seed under dirt, we may not see our own growth, and it may not be visible by human eyes, but what we cannot often see, or others cannot often see, is the seed's growth. The seed is doing what it was intended to do when it's under the soil, and it's growing and to do into what it was meant to be. It's doing the most work when it's under the soil. And I think much like a seed that is growing in the process and moving towards healing from trauma, it's a process and it takes time. And it comes with self-care and self-compassion that can be found through the garden.
I love that. It sounds like you touched on so many different things, like the patience and then the work that is put into healing and then the resilience of it. And we are built to be resilient, right? And to heal and to grow too. So yeah, you touched on so many great things. Thank you so much. Stephen, I know that we hinted that you've done this garden in the past last year as an intern at the VSC, and now you're an advocate at the VSC, which is very nice. Do you have any stories specifically from that time that you'd like to share?
I'll say that the members who were in the group last year really, really enjoyed it. They became very invested. In fact, they wanted to bring in seeds. They wanted to bring in their own plants, and they were really excited about it. I'm thinking of one specific client, and they were really happy to be in the group. And this particular person had some social anxiety and really had trouble making connections with others out in the world. And one of the benefits he got from the garden group was to be able to make that connection with the other members. And he was able to demonstrate to himself that with the social anxiety, he was able to push forward and still make that connection. And I hope that he continued to do so outside of the group as well.
That's awesome. That's another benefit I think we're seeing of it being a communal thing. Do you know if that particular client continued gardening after that?
Unfortunately, I do not know.
Okay, that's fine.
I would be interested to reach out though and see.
Yeah, you never know, right? I love that story, Stephen. I also, as I continued researching, I found that some gardens even included like a farm to table aspect to it, and that growing vegetables or fruits that are then harvested had a big impact on healing. Why do you think this process can be particularly healing for people?
So when I think of farm to table, the first thing that comes to mind is restaurants, but that's not always the case, right? Like you can have small stands or you could have donations. And if I had to do the Passion Flower Project over again, I would make it a vegetable garden just so people could learn to sustain themselves. Because growing your own food is so cool. But then that also brings in the other aspect of like, the best way to heal yourself is to give back to others. And if you're growing fruits and vegetables and you're sharing that with other people, that's going to bring you a warm sense of joy. And that it's like healthy, good food. And it's inspirational. It's rewarding to be able to like grow your own food and eat your own food, and to also help other people who may be less fortunate than you.
Yeah, and I bet you, when you were talking about the ceremonial aspect of like reflecting on the fruits of your labor, this can literally be the fruits of your labor, right? So
absolutely.
So I can see why being able to further outside of the garden even and using what they've grown in dishes or sharing or those kinds of things. I love that piece to it. So that would be really cool. If people would like to get involved with the Passion Flower Project, how could they do that?
So if you go to the Victim Service Center website, you can find a link that says donate now, and you can make a donation under the Passion Flower Project's name.
No, that's great. So people can make a donation, but it sounds like this might just be a group that's closed for clients, the current clients of the VSC.
They're for current clients, you not in crisis, and have some grounding techniques. And any kind of trauma. It doesn't have to be sexual assault DV, just to be a client of Victim Service Center.
Got it. Okay, very cool. And then with that, if people wanted to create their own community garden for healing, for example, where do you think that they could start?
You can look at churches, look at libraries. A lot of churches and libraries already have this going on, especially with the fruits and vegetables and some of the lower income communities. But if you don't have to do an entire garden to start receiving the benefits of it, if you're someone who doesn't have a lot of time or, doesn't care to be in a garden like that, get a little succulent, get something small that doesn't need a lot of attention and just provide the basic needs for it. And, when you do tend to it and care for it, be mindful of what you're doing, when you're watering it, be intentfully water it, knowing that you're nourishing the plant, pay attention to it. What do the leaves look like? Is it flowering? Is it getting ready to flower? Does like a dead leaf need to be pulled off? Anything like that. So it doesn't have to be an entire garden. You can always, take a piece of it that works for you.
Actually, you brought up a really good point, which is the concept of pruning. So do you ever use that as a metaphor, pruning your garden at all?
Yes. So we use pruning and weeding as a way of removing negativity from our life. So if you have weeds in your life, you need to get rid of them, right? The definition of a weed is an unwanted plant. It's just a plant that isn't wanted. So if there's something in your life that is toxic or negative, pull that sucker out like a weed. And while we're in the garden, we always say, imagine what it is that you're trying to get rid of out of your life. What is that toxic thing that you are trying to eliminate? And think about that while you're pulling out those weeds. And the same is true for pruning. Maybe things have gotten too out of control. And so we need to dial it back just a little bit, right? Dial it back so that our nutrients and all of our water can be focused on what is really important.
I love that. Yeah, because with gardening, and correct me if I'm wrong, there are times where you do have to prune certain parts of it so that it can put its energy to another part of the plant. Otherwise, it's putting its energy into the wrong things, right? Is that correct?
Absolutely.
That makes sense. Yeah, for concepts of healing and things like that, we are kind of plants in the sense of where our energy's going. And then maybe we can reflect on kind of where do we want them to go? And then we have the power to choose that, right? We can prune the plant and choose I don't want to put my energy into this thing that's not helping me anymore.
Exactly.
I'd like to put it into this thing that is more of what my goals and things like that. That makes a lot of sense. I love that. Danielle, did you have any, tips on, it could be certain websites or anything that you're like, hey, I want to start a community garden. I don't know how to garden at all. Do you have any tips of what would you say to someone who wants to start one, I suppose, of where they can start?
Well, I would suggest they can build their own garden box. You can Google and it'll give you step-by-step plans on how to build your own garden box. And this is something that you can just do at home. There's a lot of indoor plants as well that you could use if you don't have the outdoor space. So it doesn't have to be a big garden box, whatever size best fits your needs. But I would suggest looking that up, build your own garden box on Google. Or even just start with a small pot, if that's all that you have the room. You can start with indoor plants or outdoor plants, whatever best fits your needs.
Awesome. I love those ideas, and gardening boxes can be really cool. You can really have fun with them. Just a question that just popped in my head. Do you have any kind of starter plants? This plant is an easy one to, I know you mentioned succulents, Stephen, but are there plants that are this one's kind of good for people who just want to start out with gardening?
I would say lantana and pentas are two really good ones. And we use those in the garden a lot because they're both drought tolerant. They will lose all their leaves and they'll still come back. They really, really are hardy plants, and they bloom prolifically. And butterflies love them. Even hummingbirds love them. So that's a huge plus in my book.
I love that. Yeah, that's wonderful. Another metaphor I thought of now is perennials and annuals. So do you only use annuals in your garden, which need to be replanted every season, unlike perennials that can come back, right?
Yeah, you're right. I always get those
mixed
up. I always get them mixed up. But yes, we like to use perennials so that we can continue to see the growth over time. With an annual, you have to like switch it out every season. And the whole point of this is like so that we can grow with the plants, right? And we don't want to have to like remove something. And, you know,
That's really cool though, because that means like the next group will add to it. And it's just like continually adding. And then the fact that past group members are like, oh, this is the plant that's really cool. It's kind of like a legacy almost. Very cool.
And so each time they come to see their counselor or therapist, they, you know, they can see the garden each time. And so it's really cute. I love it. Just touching back on on indoor plants, you know, growing herbs are really, really easy. You can do them in a window. So if gardening necessarily isn't your thing, but you love to cook, that's a wonderful way to incorporate, you know, a little bit of gardening and mindfulness into that. Because cooking, you can also be very mindful in the way that you're, you know, preparing your food and eating your food. But to be able to add like some fresh herbs to your food or salad or whatever it may be, that's also very rewarding.
I love that. That's a great way to do it. And, you know, if someone, for example, for me personally, I'd like to get more into gardening, and I'd like to add that into mindful eating, for example, but it is kind of daunting to kind of do like a tomato plant or something like that. So I have myself a little herb garden that I love, that I like to go out and snip it and bring it into my dishes whenever. So I love that can be kind of, you can still get that aspect without having to do the full blown vegetable garden if you're nervous to do that. And I also wanted to ask something, you know, what if someone, what would you say to someone who is interested in healing through gardening, but may, you know, not have the space or to do it or the means? I know we talk about indoor plants, but is there a way that they can still kind of reflect on nature in that kind of way without actually planting something?
I am going to go to the journal. I love my nature journals. I always ask the groups to do it. And we do it in group and outside of group as homework. You know, like just to visually see everything is nice, but when you document it, you're really expressive when you actually write things down and like kind of spell it out, right? So if you're in a park and you bring your nature journal, like what do you see? You know, do you see trees? Is the wind blowing? And you want to describe it to the fullest, like every little detail you can. If you're looking at a bee on a flower, like what is the bee doing on the flower? Where, like, is the bee pollinating? What does the flower look like? You know, what does the stem look like? Is it a bush? You know, all those little things. And, you know, whatever catches your eye, describe it in the most detail that you can. And you'll get a lot of those benefits. And it's really nice also to kind of reflect back and like look at last week's or the week before, because it's just, especially when you write down so many details, it paints such a beautiful picture for you.
I love that. Danielle, is there anything you want to piggyback off of in regards to that?
I would say that, you know, there's nature all around us, you know, and just making that decision in your brain, like, I'm just going to be more conscious of what's around me, observe what's around me, appreciate just the little things, you know, the saying, you know, take time to smell the roses, you know. So I think we live in a society that's often busy. People can lose that appreciation just for the simple things. And I think that when we learn to reconnect to just those simple things that we can appreciate, that it just brings overall happiness and to our emotional state.
I totally see that. And thank you so much for bringing that up. I think, you know, you talk about how the first can be a grounding kind of moment, right? The first session. And it sounds like being able to be aware of our surroundings can be a really grounding thing as well, which is super important as we, you know, move towards whatever goals that we have personally in our lives. I think that's a wonderful place to sign off. But before I do, is there anything else you would like to address that we may not have covered in regards to gardening and healing or the Passion Flower Project? Anything you'd like to bring up?
I encourage anyone who's suffering from trauma to seek help, and that asking for help reveals strength.
Absolutely. piggybacking off of that, Danielle, anyone who is suffering, please do seek help. And if gardening is one of those modalities that you're able to work with, then we're happy to have you. If not, find something that will work for you. What's important is that you find your path, and that it's a path and a journey of healing.
I love that. Beautifully said. Thank you so much. And thank you to the listener for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free, confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you so much, Danielle and Stephen, for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.